I came home to find a giant red and white "Sold" sign staked into the center of my driveway like it was claiming the moon for the Queen of England. It was angled toward the street like a proud announcement to the whole neighborhood, but the kicker? My house wasn't for sale. Never had been. I hadn't spoken to a realtor, hadn't listed a thing, hadn't even so much as Googled Zillow in the last year. And yet, there it stood, towering, bold, and blocking my garage entirely. A for sale sign with the audacity of a royal decree. The culprit? Oh, I didn't even need to guess. Karen. Karen lived 3 houses down in a tastefully tacky beige monstrosity with wrought iron flamingos on the lawn and surveillance cameras disguised as bird feeders. She was the self-proclaimed vice president of our HOA, a title she awarded herself after accidentally locking out the previous one during a vote. The woman was like a human LinkedIn profile, fake title, inflated importance, and always looking for a way to leverage her imagined power into real chaos. And lately, she'd been laser-focused on me. First, it was my mailbox, which apparently clashed with the neighborhood aesthetic. Then it was my lawn, which she said had too much personality. And now this. I walked up to the sign and yanked it out of the gravel. It had real weight to it, the kind that suggested she hadn't just printed it at home. It had the logo of a local realty company on the bottom, but I doubted they had any idea she was staging fake property transactions like some suburban monopoly tyrant. I flipped it over. Written in Sharpie across the back were the words, "Touring today at 3 p.m. She wasn't just claiming my property, she was selling it. To who? No clue. But I had about 2 hours to figure it out. I didn't call the police. I didn't call the realtor. I didn't even call the HOA, since Karen was the HOA, at least in her mind. No, I started with a lawn chair, a cooler of iced tea, and a speaker playing military marching music on loop. Then I printed a big laminated sign that read, "Private Military Zone. No tours. No trespassing. Violators will be subject to field training." That part was true, in a way. I'd served in the military for over a decade, and I still had friends who owed me favors. If Karen wanted drama, I'd hand-deliver the script. At exactly 3 p.m., a luxury SUV rolled up and parked at the curb. Out stepped a couple dressed like they had watched one too many HGTV marathons, designer jeans, coordinated vests, and faces eager to renovate. Behind them, the Queen herself emerged. Karen. Hair freshly bleached and sprayed into a helmet of suburban authority, clipboard in hand, and wearing a smug smile that told me she genuinely believed this stunt was going to work. She froze when she saw me sitting on my lawn next to the giant private military zone sign. Her eyes darted to the marching music, then to the cooler, then to the mock security camera I'd mounted on the porch. The couple hesitated, clearly confused. I waved casually. "Afternoon," I called. "Didn't realize we were doing unauthorized home tours today. Let me know if you want a field demo of perimeter defense." The woman's jaw dropped. The man took a half step back. Karen clutched her clipboard like a life vest and marched up to me, hissing low enough that only I could hear. "What do you think you're doing?" "Responding to a potential hostile incursion," I replied cheerfully. "You wouldn't happen to be the one who planted enemy propaganda in my driveway, would you?" She blustered, said something about a misunderstanding, that the sign must have been a joke, and that she had no idea how it got there. I didn't even try to hide the grin. "You really shouldn't impersonate a realtor, Karen," I said. "That's a state-level offense. Pretty sure the Department of Real Estate has a form for exactly this." The prospective buyers had already begun retreating back to their SUV, murmuring about weird vibes and not worth the risk. Karen looked from them to me and back again, her mouth working like she was trying to chew invisible gum. Then she did what she always did when backed into a corner. She doubled down. "You're violating HOA codes with that ridiculous sign," she barked, pointing at my private military zone display. "It's threatening, inappropriate, and I'm filing a report." "I welcome it," I said, cracking open another iced tea. I've already notified the HOA board. The real one. Also, fun fact, placing fraudulent signs on someone else's property? That's trespassing and harassment. You might want to update your legal dictionary. Her face flushed beet red. She spun on her heels and stormed off like a tantruming dictator, muttering threats over her shoulder. I watched her go, relaxed, and took another sip. But I knew this wasn't over. Karen never walked away unless she was winding up for a bigger swing. That night, I installed a motion sensor spotlight, a second mock security camera, and a laser-etched sign that read, "Authorized entry only. Military clearance required." I wasn't bluffing anymore. I had a plan. Karen wanted a battle? She was about to find out what a real military-grade response looked like. The next morning, she retaliated by posting in the HOA newsletter an entire page dedicated to how paramilitary aesthetics were ruining the family-friendly atmosphere of our neighborhood. She even included a blurry photo of my sign and some creative Photoshop work to make it look like I had mounted a turret on my roof. She called for an emergency HOA vote to impose a decor code and claimed she had unanimous support. But what Karen didn't know was that I had spent the last 6 months slowly building goodwill with my neighbors, fixed a few roofs, helped trim a tree or two, organized a 4th of July barbecue, and didn't call it a mandatory community event. And I knew for a fact that most of the neighborhood was sick of her nonsense. She ruled through intimidation and bylaws, but no one liked her. And I was about to give them a reason to stop pretending they did. I printed out copies of her fake, sold sign. Passed them out with a note that said, "Next time it might be your house." I attached a QR code linking to state law on fraudulent real estate practices and a link to file complaints against HOA. By noon, 3 people had already emailed the city. By 3 p.m., someone hacked the HOA site and replaced her newsletter with a gif of a hamster parachuting into battle. Karen's screams echoed through the neighborhood like a banshee with a lawsuit. She ran door to door, accusing everyone of conspiring against her. That was the moment I knew the tide had turned. But we were still just in the warm-up phase. Because if she wanted to keep escalating, I had no problem going nuclear. I had one more sign waiting in the garage. And this one? It came with uniforms. By sunrise the next morning, I was already up, sipping coffee on my porch and watching the street like it was enemy territory. Karen's house was dark, but I knew she'd be stirring soon. Her kind doesn't sleep so much as enter a resting surveillance state. Sure enough, by 7:06 a.m., her blinds snapped open like they were controlled by NORAD. 10 minutes later, she stepped outside with her dog, a tiny white puffball named Sir Barkington, and immediately froze when she saw the new sign I'd mounted to the fence beside my driveway. It was professional-grade aluminum, framed in steel, with crisp stenciled letters that read, "Property of Federal Contractor. Trespassing will trigger live monitoring." I had even wired a blinking red light to the post for extra paranoia. It blinked once every 3 seconds, slow enough to make people wonder if it was real, fast enough to make them question if they wanted to find out. The sign wasn't a lie. Technically, I still held contractor clearance from a previous project, and the area around my home was now designated for testing security protocols. At least, that's what my former CO agreed to claim if anyone called. Karen stood there, slack-jawed, one hand on her hip, the other tightening around Sir Barkington's leash like it was a weapon. I gave her a lazy salute. She flipped me off so aggressively she almost fell over. But here's the thing about suburban warfare. Most people fight with whispers and committee vote. Karen? She fought like a toddler with access to a printer and no understanding of boundaries. And today she was bringing in reinforcements. Around noon, a convoy of SUVs arrived. I watched from my upstairs office window as 5 well-dressed strangers exited, along with 2 familiar figures, Karen and a man who I immediately recognized from his smug headshots on local real estate benches. Mark Denslow. One of those agents who posed with his arms crossed like he was negotiating peace treaties. Karen was bouncing on her heels, pointing at my house, my yard, and especially my signs. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I didn't need to. I could see her mouth forming exaggerated shapes as she talked. She gestured at her clipboard, then at the new sign, then at my security lights like she was assembling evidence for the HOA version of a war crimes tribunal. The group followed her up the driveway as if they were on an official inspection. That's when I played my next card. I remotely activated the speaker system I had wired through my hedges. A booming male voice echoed from hidden corners of the yard. Warning. You are entering a monitored zone. Identification required. Trespassers may be subject to non-lethal defense protocols. They stopped cold. The real estate agent glanced back toward his SUV, visibly sweating. Karen, to her credit, kept walking until the sprinklers turned on. Not ordinary sprinklers, ones I had rigged to deliver a harmless mist of red-dyed water. It stained absolutely nothing but gave the distinct impression that they'd just been marked by a perimeter system. Two of the guests screamed. One ran back to his car. Mark Denslow raised his voice loud enough for me to hear through the window. What the hell is going on here? Karen was shrieking about HOA mandates and unlicensed weapons systems. She tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The last two agents bolted, one of them dropping his briefcase, which I later found contained a stack of open house flyers, with my address printed across the top. I snapped a photo and sent it to the city licensing board. Then I printed the flyers and left a stack on Karen's porch with a sticky note that said, "Next time, bring cookies." By 4 p.m., a cease and desist letter arrived, addressed to Karen. Apparently, Mark Denslow's firm wanted nothing to do with a woman staging illegal house tours using fake listings. I couldn't prove it, but I suspected they'd also gotten calls from a few retired friends of mine who may have mentioned words like wire fraud and impersonation of federal property. Karen's expression when she read the letter on her front lawn was pure fury. Her fake realtor dreams were officially dead. But she wasn't. Not yet. Because when Karen couldn't fight from the outside, she tried to infiltrate from within. 3 days later, I received an envelope in my mailbox. It was a printed notice from the HOA, one I'd never seen before. It claimed I was in violation of exterior structure compliance, a rule that, as far as I could tell, Karen had just invented. The letter said I had 48 hours to remove all signage, audio equipment, and military-grade decor. Failure to comply, it warned, would result in escalating fines. There were two problems with this. 1. Karen wasn't authorized to issue fines. 2. I was authorized to file formal complaints, and I'd been keeping receipt. So I sent a reply, certified mail, CCing the real HOA president, a kind but exhausted retiree named Linda, the city council's neighborhood enforcement officer, and the county zoning commissioner. I included timestamps, photos, recordings, and even an annotated map showing where Karen had trespassed, vandalized, and staged unauthorized sales attempts. I didn't go nuclear, I went bureaucratic. And in suburban warfare, bureaucracy is napalm. 3 days later, Linda came to visit me personally. She looked tired but grateful. "God bless you," she said, clutching a coffee I had just handed her. "You have no idea how long we've been waiting for someone to deal with her." "She's persistent," I offered. "She's the reason our last 3 presidents quit," Linda replied, rubbing her temples. "We never had proof before. You just handed us a war chest." Apparently, Karen had spent the last 2 years slowly rigging every vote, silencing dissent with fake rule citations, and intimidating elderly board members into resigning. But now there was paper, real documentation, and Linda had brought backup, 2 other board members, one of whom had worked in civil litigation. By sunset, the HOA had voted to suspend Karen from all leadership roles, pending a full investigation. She wasn't fired yet, but she was cornered. And cornered Karens? They lash out. That night, around 2:30 a.m., my doorbell rang. I didn't answer, because I was watching her on the security feed. Karen, in a hoodie, standing on my porch with what looked like bolt cutters. She bent toward the private military zone sign, clearly trying to rip it down. What she didn't realize was that the post was wired. Not to anything dangerous, but to a pressure sensor that tripped every light in my yard and triggered a very loud recording. "Step away from the fence. You are being recorded. Authorities have been notified." She yelped and stumbled backward, tripping over her own feet and landing in a flower bed. Then she ran, barefoot, back to her house, swearing all the way. I didn't even need to call the cops. The footage went straight to Linda, and by morning, the entire neighborhood had seen it. Karen was finished. Or so I thought. Because when people like Karen lose power, they don't disappear. They mutate. They regroup. And the next move she made? She didn't try to fight the HOA. She tried to take it. It started with a bake sale. That's how Karen began her resurrection campaign. A community unity brunch, she called it, hosted right on her manicured lawn, complete with color-coordinated balloon arches, folding tables lined with pound cake and suspiciously undercooked quiches, and hand-lettered signs begging for reinstatement of community values. It was less about muffins and more about mutiny. Her little event wasn't innocent, it was strategic. Karen had realized she couldn't control the HOA board anymore, so she went after the next best thing, the neighbors. And she came armed with cookies, flattery, and the absolute gall of someone who believed she had been wronged. I watched from across the street as she handed out pamphlets disguised as brunch menus. Each one included thinly veiled swipes at unauthorized installations, militant elements, and residents who believe their property outweighs their responsibility to the community. She never used my name, but she didn't need to. The red arrows, both literal and figurative, all pointed at my house. I considered ignoring her. Let her fling gluten-laced grenades at the neighborhood while I carried on with my life. But the problem with people like Karen is that they don't just spread drama, they spread narratives. And if you let a narrative sit long enough, it grows root. So I paid a visit to the brunch. I arrived in full hiking gear, boots, vest, sunglasses, tactical backpack. I didn't say a word as I walked through the crowd and selected a single undercooked scone from the table, took a bite, winced dramatically, and dropped the rest into a compost bin. Karen locked eyes with me from across the lawn. I could see her calculating whether to confront me publicly or hold her fire. She chose diplomacy, sort of. "Lovely day for neighborly bonding," she said sweetly, arms crossed. "So glad you could come out and be visible." "Happy to support community health," I replied. "In fact, I've got a few thoughts on improving it. Starting with identifying sources of airborne misinformation." A few heads turned. Karen's smile cracked. "I'm just trying to rebuild," she said through gritted teeth. "After being slandered and politically sabotaged." "Ah yes," I nodded. "The classic Karen coup recovery arc. Tell me, do the muffins come with subpoenas or just gaslighting?" That earned a snort from an elderly man holding a deviled egg. Karen flushed scarlet. She tried to rally, calling for a toast to neighborhood harmony, but her voice faltered. The energy shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough. People began murmuring. Some looked down at their plates. Others just walked away. And one of the HOA board members, Linda's friend, the retired civil litigator, stepped beside me and clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Nice to see someone actually keeping it real," he said. Karen's event sputtered. It didn't collapse, not entirely. But it didn't turn the tide either. And when that failed, she escalated again. This time with legalese. 2 weeks later, I received a letter. Not from Karen, not from the HOA, but from a lawyer. A real one. I could tell by the watermark, the formatting, and the strategically vague but intimidating language. It claimed that my signs, lights, and surveillance systems were creating psychological distress for certain community members and demanded their immediate removal pending further review by neighborhood council. It was signed by Michael J. Klein, ESQ, a name I recognized because, fun fact, I once beat him in a contract dispute 6 years ago. I called his office and left a message. Tell Mike it's the guy who buried his case in 3 paragraphs and a spreadsheet. If he wants to tango again, I'm still wearing the same shoes. Never got a callback. But I did get something else. A surprise inspection from City Code Enforcement. Someone, I wonder who, had filed a complaint claiming I was operating a private security business without a license. A uniformed inspector showed up at 8 a.m. sharp and started taking photos of my fence, cameras, and signs. Just doing my job, he said when I asked. I respect that, I said, handing him a folder already prepared with zoning permits, equipment specs, and signed affidavits from my neighbors affirming everything was non-commercial and fully compliant. He flipped through it, eyebrows climbing with each page. By the end, he was chuckling. All right, he said, handing it back. Someone clearly thought they'd get you on a technicality. Someone clearly underestimated my love of paperwork, I replied. He grinned. You're clear. But just so you know, she filed 4 separate complaints in the last month. All of them targeting your property. That was the moment I realized Karen had stopped playing to win, she was just playing to wear me down. Not unlike trench warfare, but with subpoenas instead of shrapnel. So I responded accordingly. Not with escalation. With exposure. I called a meeting. A real one. I rented out the community center, printed flyers titled, Know Your HOA, What They Can't Tell You, and invited every resident in a 3-block radius. I even offered snacks, good ones, from the bakery that Karen had once tried to shut down for odors inconsistent with HOA standards. The turnout was better than expected. Maybe 35 people. I gave a calm, concise presentation. I brought charts. I explained how HOA rules actually work. I passed around copies of the real bylaws, highlighted, annotated, and cross-referenced. Then I showed them what Karen had been doing behind the scenes. Editing the digital rulebook, issuing fake fines, inventing clauses, staging property seizures. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't need to. The facts were outrageous enough. When I showed them the flyer with my house listed for sale, the one Karen had printed, there were audible gasps. One guy swore under his breath. Another woman actually stood up and said, "Wait, she tried to sell your house?" It was like watching a courtroom slowly turn on the defendant. And then Linda stood up. She wasn't part of the plan. I hadn't asked her to speak. But she took the front of the room like a battle-worn general addressing her troops. "She's been manipulating this community for years," Linda said. "We've let it happen. We've let her shout us down, scare us, divide us. But no more." Applause. Real, spontaneous applause. Karen didn't attend that meeting. But she heard about it. And the next day, something incredible happened. Half the neighborhood took down their HOA flags. Just small ones. Little banners people used to hang from porches. But now? Gone. In their place? Nothing official. No signs, no slogans. Just silence. Karen, of course, responded with another letter. This one handwritten and shoved into every mailbox. It claimed she was being slandered by a militant rogue actor, and accused me of initiating psychological warfare with help from a covert neighborhood cell. I framed that one. It's currently hanging in my garage next to the torque wrench. But she wasn't done. Not even close. Because that afternoon I got a visit. Not from Karen. Not from a lawyer. From a government agent. Real badge. Real ID. Real questions. The agent's name was Doyle. He showed up in a black government sedan that screamed official business, parked right in front of my mailbox like he owned the asphalt, and stepped out wearing the kind of calm authority that made people involuntarily stand up straighter. He didn't knock. He rang the bell twice and waited precisely 10 seconds before speaking into the intercom. "Mr. Wallace. Agent Doyle, DHS Civilian Oversight Division. We need to have a conversation." I opened the door casually, half a granola bar still in hand. About my flower beds? Or are we here for the Neighborhood Watch's missile program? His expression didn't even twitch. I'd appreciate it if we could talk inside. We sat at my kitchen table, where I offered him coffee, which he politely declined, and then proceeded to go over a very real report that had been filed through an anonymous DHS tip line. The report claimed I was operating a paramilitary training camp disguised as a suburban home, complete with a recruitment network, surveillance web, and active threat protocols. It was, without a doubt, the single most insane thing I'd ever heard said about me, and this included the time Karen accused me of running a black market duck breeding operation out of my tool shed. Agent Doyle was professional, thorough, and frustratingly unreadable. He asked me to walk him through the origin of the Private Military Zone sign, explain every piece of visible security equipment, and provide documentation for any former military or contractor status. Luckily for me, I keep good records. Old habits die hard. Half an hour later, he was holding a manila folder thick with proof that not only was I not running a rogue militia, I was still technically in good standing with a federal agency that had once classified me as exceptionally compliant. I leaned back and gave him a slow smile. So, Agent Doyle, am I getting black bagged today, or do I get a sticker? He finally cracked a smirk. No, Mr. Wallace. But I do have one more question. Shoot. Do you have any idea who would go to this much trouble to report something so thoroughly ridiculous? I stared at him for a beat. Then I slid open a drawer, pulled out a red folder labeled Karen, Escalation Protocols, and handed it to him. He flipped it open and blinked. Inside were time-stamped photos, screenshots of her fake HOA notices, doctored real estate flyers, and a short essay titled An Entitled Woman's Descent into Suburban Warfare, a case study. I had a feeling, he said. She's a threat to local sanity, national productivity, and the structural integrity of every HOA within a 50-mile radius, I said. But mostly, she's a threat to peace and quiet. And that's where I draw the line. He closed the folder, stood, and offered a handshake. You won't hear from us again. And if anyone else files a federal complaint against you without just cause, this visit and your records cover it. Officially. I nodded, shaking his hand. Much appreciated. If she calls in the CIA next week, just tell them to bring donuts. He chuckled as he left. But I wasn't laughing. Because now I knew Karen was willing to weaponize federal resources just to win a feud. That meant it was time to execute Phase 4. I didn't retaliate with more signs or gadget. That's what she expected. Karen thought we were in a battle of lawn decorations. She had no idea I was already deep into the psychological campaign phase. And my next move? A bombshell that didn't explode. It quietly changed everything. 3 days later, I announced my candidacy for HOA president. I filed the paperwork with Linda and posted a single flyer on the community board by the clubhouse. It read, "It's time for order. Wallace 2025. No slogans. No slander. Just the promise of peace through competence." Karen, naturally, lost her mind. She held a last-minute emergency meeting, unofficial, of course, where she tried to smear me as a destabilizing force with a proven track record of militant behavior. She warned of martial law disguised as neighborhood improvement. She even printed fake flyers that showed my face superimposed on a general's uniform, standing in front of tanks. I collected one and framed it. The graphic design was awful, but the effort was hilarious. The problem for Karen was that no one was listening anymore. The neighborhood was tired. Tired of her inspections, her newsletters, her impromptu yard invasions. And I was the calm, rational alternative. I didn't promise to make the HOA great again. I promised to make it invisible, functional, quiet, boring. And here's the twist. I didn't even want the job. This wasn't about power. It was about denying Karen hers. The campaign moved fast. By the end of the week, I had 25 signatures out of the 30 needed to automatically trigger a leadership vote. But before I could hit 30, Karen made one last desperate move. She called the news. That's right. Karen contacted a local cable channel and claimed she was being targeted by a rogue veteran using psychological warfare tactics to seize control of her HOA. Somehow, she convinced them to send a crew. I found out when a news van parked in front of my house and a reporter rang the doorbell. "Hi, Mr. Wallace, we're doing a story on neighborhood extremism. Would you like to comment?" I invited them in. And then I gave them the truth. I showed them everything. The signs. The real estate flyers. The video footage of Karen trespassing. The cease and desist letter from the realtor. The city's official documentation clearing me of every false complaint. I handed them a narrative so tight and outrageous that they didn't just run it, they led with it. The segment aired 2 nights later, titled, "Suburban Sabotage, When HOA Power Goes Too Far." Karen's face was all over it. Screaming on a ring cam. Storming across lawns. Waving flyers. One of her old quotes, "Sometimes you have to bend rules to protect community values," was replayed in slow motion over ominous music. The day after the segment aired, 2 things happened. First, I got the remaining 5 signatures needed for the vote. Second, Karen's mailbox was mysteriously filled with HOA violation notices. Real ones, this time. Linda had finally found her backbone. And she wasn't the only one. Neighbors started organizing without her. A real community cleanup was scheduled, and she wasn't invited. A 4th of July parade plan was drafted, and she wasn't on the route committee. Karen wasn't just being voted out. She was being erased. The vote was scheduled for Saturday. Karen, in one final display of flailing delusion, printed up "Re-elect Karen" signs and planted them on every corner. Half were stolen or vandalized by dawn. I didn't say a word during the meeting. I didn't need to. Linda read the votes aloud in a steady voice. Final tally, Wallace 43. Karen 3. Her eyes were wide, like she couldn't comprehend it. Like the numbers betrayed her. And when it was over, she stood up and pointed at me with a trembling finger. "You think this is over?" she hissed. "I own this place. I made this neighborhood." "No, Karen," I said, as calmly as I'd ever spoken. "You poisoned it. I'm just here to clean up." The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't need to. The silence was enough. But I wasn't done yet. Karen found out at 8:17 a.m. the next morning, when she stepped outside to retrieve her newspaper and saw the large white utility flag planted in her front yard. It was small, discreet, but unmistakable, an official survey marker, the kind that precedes infrastructure changes. She stared at it, puzzled, then noticed the yellow spray-painted boundary lines stretching across her lawn like alien crop circles. I watched from my porch as the realization began to dawn across her face, slow and horrifying, like someone watching floodwaters rise inside their own home. She darted back inside and emerged seconds later, phone in hand, barking at someone through the speaker. She didn't know it yet, but no phone call was going to fix this. See, about 3 months prior, back when she first posted that fraudulent "sold" sign on my driveway, I started digging. Not metaphorically. Legally. I had discovered, buried in the township's archaic records, a 20-year-old zoning loophole involving unused land rights beneath several homes in our neighborhood. Turns out, when this development was built, the original landowner had retained subterranean mineral rights and a sliver of surface access tied to a dormant easement, one that extended directly beneath Karen's home and the adjacent lots. That landowner? Died 2 years ago. The rights? Went to auction. The buyer? Me. For less than the price of a used ATV, I acquired legal ownership of the subterranean easement beneath Karen's lot, including a 10-foot buffer on the surface for utility development access, which, under the original clause, could not be restricted by existing homeowners. It had never mattered, until now. But after she tried to weaponize the federal government against me, I decided it was time to unearth that old power, literally. Which is why a week after the vote, I filed a formal development notice, the installation of a private data infrastructure hub on my new plot. Translation? A shed. For gardening. But legally? A project requiring access, digging, temporary fencing, and yes, a portion of Karen's front yard. The moment she saw that flag, she sprinted across the street, face red, robe flapping, eyes wild. "You can't do this," she screamed. "I am doing this," I replied calmly, sipping my coffee. "Technically, you're trespassing on my land." "You're lying. This is illegal. I'm calling the city. The sheriff. The governor." I held up a folder. The same one I'd shown the DHS agent. But now it had grown. Inside was the purchase deed, the development permit, the plat map, and a fresh letter from a zoning board lawyer confirming my rights to proceed. "I did offer to negotiate," I said smoothly. "You never responded. So here we are." Her mouth opened and closed like a gasping fish. Then she spun around and stormed off. Within hours, her front lawn was staked with more flags. A small team arrived wearing safety vests and began measuring distances. I wasn't actually installing anything yet, but the project was approved, real, and fully compliant. I had even hired the most annoyingly meticulous site manager I could find. Karen stood at her window, hands clenched at her sides, glaring like she could melt tape measures with her eyes. The neighborhood began buzzing with curiosity. Whispers turned into conversations. People wandered over to ask what was happening, and I explained it all with serene politeness. Some gasped. Some laughed. One guy high-fived me. Word spread fast. Karen's reign was not only over, it was being dug up from underneath her. And then came the real cherry on top. See, one of the contingencies in the easement allowed for temporary signage during development. Not advertising, just legally required notice of restricted access zones. So I put up a sign. Not a joke one. A real, compliant, aluminum panel that read, "Private Military Zone Infrastructure Installation in Progress." I added small type underneath. By legal access of Parcel 18B, subsurface easement rights. Karen lost what was left of her mind. She filed 3 complaints in 24 hours. One with the city, one with the HOA, which I now ran, and one, again, with Homeland Security. All 3 were dismissed. And then came the knock. I opened the door to find Karen standing on my porch, holding a plate of brownies. Not poison ones, surprisingly, actual brownies. Still warm. "Can we talk?" she asked, forcing a brittle smile. Her eyes were puffy. Her hair disheveled. She looked a human for the first time. I let her in. We sat at the same table where Agent Doyle once quizzed me on potential insurgencies. Karen placed the plate between us like it was a peace treaty. "Look," she said. "I know things got out of hand." "That's an understatement." "I was trying to help the neighborhood," she said. "I really was. Maybe I got carried away." I didn't respond. I let the silence stretch. "I've lived here 18 years, she continued, voice wobbling. "I was part of building this community. And I just thought if I didn't control it, everything would fall apart." "You don't fix a garden by ripping out your neighbor's roses," I said. "You water your own." She looked down at her lap. "I'm sorry. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't sincere. But it was something." I nodded. "Thank you. That's a start." We didn't become friends. We didn't hug. She left the brownies and walked out quietly. The next day, the survey team finished. I filed a notice of project suspension. No actual digging would occur. I just needed her to feel it, to understand that I could, if I wanted to, turn her life into a series of small, legal nightmares. But I wouldn't. Because I wasn't her. I removed the sign the day after. The private military zone was over. Karen, for the first time in years, kept to herself. She stopped attending HOA meetings. She stopped writing newsletters. Occasionally, she'd wave to neighbors. Once, she even offered someone help carrying groceries. The transformation wasn't dramatic, but it was real. And me? I resigned from the HOA presidency 2 months later, after implementing a rule that limited board terms to 1 year and removed any single person's ability to act unilaterally. Linda took over again, this time with a full board and a voting quorum that actually showed up. The neighborhood healed. But every now and then, I catch Karen standing at her window, watching the street with a cautious, haunted look. Like someone who's seen what happens when the wrong enemy picks the wrong fight. She never put another sign in my yard again. And I still own the ground beneath her house. Not because I want it, but because it reminds us both, some territories are best left undisturbed.